Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Fall Bounce Grand Rounds. We have a great program this morning, and we've got a lot to cover, but I want to give people a few more minutes for everybody to get in. So while we're waiting, if you would, introduce yourself in the chat and just put a sentence or two about what is the first thing you think of when you think about foster care. So if you would just do that, we will get started in just a couple of minutes.
Excuse me, can you repeat what you just said? I just now, I missed out on some of it.
Of course, and just welcome, and we're glad you're here this morning. We've got a great topic going, but while we're waiting for others to come in, if you would just take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat and just tell us the first thing you think of when you think of foster care, just a sentence or two about when you hear the word foster care, what does it bring to mind?
Shannon, I love your response, how the removal could have been prevented. So thank you for putting that out there. Healing, yeah, these are really good.
Yeah.
Traumatic events, you bet. For anybody who maybe just joined us, Barbara is asking folks to introduce yourself in the chat and just let us know what comes to mind when you hear the word foster care. And we can keep collecting those as we open.
Okay, and you can keep adding those, but I want to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of ground to cover, and we're so glad to have Sarah here to help us with that. I'd like to turn the program now over to BJ Atkins, and she is our Bounce Coalition co-chair.
Thanks, Barbara. Well, first, on behalf of Bounce, welcome everyone. It's so great to see so many people and your faces. You are the reason that Bounce is reaching out through the entire state of Kentucky. And Stephanie, I love you too. And we welcome you to be with us and join us. Bounce is growing like leaps and bounds. We've got some really great news coming up around the corner, but we'll be even doing more integral work within the state. But one of the things that I want to bring forward today that I think is important, we had 2 new members join our executive team of leaders. And I see one of them is with us today, Keith Eckman, and the other is Damon Sweeney. And I would like to give you just a little bit of information about them. And I'm going to look at my other computer because I could not remember everything there is to say. But Damien is the program coordinator for comprehensive school counseling at Kentucky Department of Education. I'm from the Department of Health at one time, working with school counselors, equipping them with best practices. So that's a real important piece of what Bounce wants to do, work within the schools, have the school counselors understand the child in trauma. Damien, also Dr. Sweeney, is also an adjunct professor at the University of Cumberland and Spalding University. So he has a passion, and he has a passion for social justice, and he's shown that throughout his career. Keith, I would love to take the opportunity to introduce you, but since you're here, would you like to talk for yourself? Keith,
Sure,
I'm going
BJ.
to start by saying he's from New York City and he brings a whole wealth of knowledge to us, or he's in New York City right now. Keith?
All right, can you hear me, BJ?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. It's great to be at my first Bounce Coalition meeting. Yeah, I'm Keith Eckman. I'm the Executive Director for Collective Impact for the International Institute for Restorative Practices, the IRP Graduate School. I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky, born and raised. Family still lives there. Been living in New York since 1999. And I have extensive experience working with ACEs and a number of other K-12 national initiatives such as SEL and restorative practice, of course, and PBIS, and have had the opportunity to work across many states and across many school districts in implementing best practices for improvement of climate and culture. So it's great to be here and great to be a part of the executive committee for Bounce. Thank you, BJ.
Thank you, Keith, and we look forward to working with you throughout the next several years. So today, like we had mentioned, Sarah Stalker is with us today, and we're really proud to have her join us. Sarah's an advocate, and not only that, she walks the talk. Sarah's a child advocate with the Department of Community-Based Service foster parents, and she's been doing this since 2015. 6 years, Sarah. That's quite a bit, and we're really proud that you're here. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here. Are we ready? We can just jump right in because we have a lot of ground to cover. So thank you for the welcome and the intro. Like BJ said, I've been doing this for quite some time, and I've had a lot of firsthand experiences to see what it's like for kids to be in care. And I want to share some of those things with you all today. And I'm gonna kind of give you a broad swath of information because really I could talk to you for days and days and days about this. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And are we all good? We're all seeing presentation? Okay, so jumping right in, hang on just one moment, please, for some reason. Oops, this is what happens when you have one too many screens. Okay, so I get this question a lot over the years. I think when people just are talking to me out and about, I always have an opinion about something, and so I just get this question a lot, and my response is always like, well, what do you think I do? Just based off of whatever it is that you're hearing me say. But while these are all really great professions and important professions, particularly with our kids that are in care, I am none of these things. I just play them on TV. But so here are some things that I do, things that I'm connected with. As BJ mentioned, I'm a foster parent with DCBS. So through the state, though there are other foster parents throughout, other agencies, whether those be for-profit, nonprofit. I'm a biological parent to begin with. I started doing this when my kids were 7 and 11. So it's been a minute. I'm really a big proponent of trauma-informed care, and I want everyone to be as educated on this as possible because I feel like the root of everything is trauma, and until we address that, we're not going to make the kind of headway that we need to as a community and specifically on behalf of kids. So I work with Aetna on some advisory boards for them. I've done some advising, small board for the cabinet. I work with U of K. So the list is here. And particularly, it's important to point out that our family is specifically 12 and up. We take kiddos that are non-white, kids that are LGBTQ. And those are two demographics that we're going to touch on just briefly today because there's a huge need for those kids. The majority of parents, foster parents, are looking for littles, and 6 has become the new 16 is something that you've probably, if you've been in any sort of room with me, might have heard me say before. So we work with kiddos that are 12 and up, and we take sibling groups as well. So there's a real need for all of those things: older kids, sibling groups, LGBTQ, and kids that are non-white. And we just don't have enough families, unfortunately. So give me just a second. My mouse is jumping all over the place. So I'm just going to, just because we don't know who's in the room, I'm going to touch base really quick just about the ACEs. So if you're not familiar with the initial study, these were the categories that were touched on through the Kaiser Permanente back in the 90s, I think it was, or early 2000s. So we know that they're common, and then we know that almost everybody, or a lot of people, have had at least one ACE experience. But what I'm really going to touch on is how that adversity and trauma fixes, rewires our kids' brains, and how that can make their experience moving forward in foster care, but in life in general, can be really can be tough. I think it's really important to also point out the fact that those particular initial 10 questions that are part of the ACE, and I have some resources at the end, so I definitely will include those for you guys in the slides. There's a lot of things that are missing, particularly around discrimination. What your environment is like outside of your home. There's a lot of kids who might be struggling for one reason or another inside their home, but there's a lot of love, and those parents are doing the best that they can, and they have other things that they're working against, and sometimes those things are outside of their home. And then this is also important to know that you do have protective factors, right? So just because you have an ACE score of whatever the number is, it doesn't mean that you can't be resilient, that you're going to have a horrible outcome in life by any means. It's just a heads up to say, hey, the higher your score is, the higher chance that you have for future health concerns down the road that are really concerning and cost us a lot of money on top of it as well. So this is I'm not going to read this to you all, but this is really important to understand why trauma and the way it affects kids' brains, why this is so important for us to tackle. A lot of times people, when they talk to me and they hear that I'm a foster parent, they say, oh, I'm so glad that kid's with you, they're safe now. And that's just not the truth. Like, I'm a safe person. I know what goes on in my home, but kids leaving your home is traumatic. And then when kids are in the foster care system, they're moving around a lot, probably more than people really understand. And that can be for a myriad of reasons, but I really think a lot of that has to do with kids' behavior. And I want to just talk about that word for a second, because I kind of just, I don't like that word. Probably because I hear it all the time used in a school setting, like, oh, that kid has so many behavior problems. And for me, and maybe, I don't know, maybe the rest of the world doesn't think of it this way, but when I hear that, I feel like what people are thinking about is, that they're a bad kid. And I've heard people say, like, oh, he's such a bad kid. And I'm like, there are no bad kids. There are kids that have had really hard things happen to them. And behavior is really, that's trauma. That is just the way trauma shows up. And that is their brain and their body doing exactly what it should be doing because of that trauma. So I'd really love for us, I always say words create worlds, to think about how we can change our language around using the word behavior. And if we could replace that word with trauma, I think that would kind of allow us to pause and think about how we might want to respond to that young person. So I'm sure many of you have heard of this, but I just want to touch on this just quickly, that a lot of times our kids, they're dealing with an overactive stress response. And their amygdala is getting hijacked frequently. They're getting triggered, and it's tough. And so we talk about a lot of times coming at things from a trauma-informed care lens or response. And so I just wanted to put this up here so that, if you're looking at the size of that little kidney size bean of the amygdala, it's small. And a lot of when our kids are, feeling stressed, a lot of the oxygen in that blood, instead of being right there in the front of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, it's getting, traffic is being re-diverted And that can cause people to do things that they're just like, what were you thinking, right? Because it's a protective mechanism. It's like a fight or flight type of thing. And I'm sure we've all had moments where we've done something out of a moment of whatever, and you're just like, I don't know what I was thinking. It's just kind of that your brain kind of takes over. So I just wanted to put that up there. And again, words create worlds. So let's change the question to what happened to you instead of some of these other not helpful phrases when we interact with young people or adults. A lot of this stuff is applicable to everybody, but definitely kids that are in care. So that toxic stress, how we talked about, what do we know about ACEs? It affects these, these particular things for kids a lot. So if you think about them or yourself as having a thermostat, when we're in stressful situations, right, we can escalate and then we can come back down when we realize that we're safe. What a lot of our young people can't do because of these adverse childhood experiences is one of two things can happen to their little internal thermostat. Either they can't come down, right? They're just kind of high up there, they're escalated, they're hot, and they can't come back down, and they spend a lot of time up there. Or their fuse is just a lot shorter than what you would expect. And I had a kid who I had a lot of experience with that. I mean, it was like walking on eggshells. A lot of times it could be really simple things that, like, oh, hey, we're going to go do this, we're going to go out for dinner, or, just things that weren't what you would think are big deals. And the response, and for him, he got very angry very quickly and just kind of, just flipped his lid. And it was difficult. And I didn't understand at the time what was going on because it didn't make sense to me because I didn't know a lot of what I know now. So I want to touch on these because a lot of these things, affect our kids' ability, not only with their placements, but also their ability to function at their best potential at school. And I always say kids, unfortunately, don't have the luxury of checking their baggage at the door and coming in and able to learn. So they've got some other more important things going on. Triggers. I wish we got a warning, right? But we don't. And, triggers are tricky. I'm assuming most people know what they are, but basically it's anything that is going to evoke an emotion out of our kids. And I've definitely have had moments where I've been able to look back and realize, oh, this kid was triggered. And sometimes kids have the ability to tell you that really triggered me, or they may not use that word. They may say, that it upset them, but it could be any and everything. I know I've had kiddos who showering has been an issue. So for kids who might have had not great things go down with them from a sexual abuse standpoint, when it came time to bathing, that could be really hard for them, particularly also with older kiddos. If you've experienced sexual abuse, and a lot of kids who come into care, while there are kids who get removed for that reason, there's a great percentage of kids that are not disclosing that information until after they've been removed for another situation. And once they feel that they're safe, they will disclose that information. And I've had situations with kids for that too. So maybe they don't want to shower. And for me, I'm kind of like, hey, personal hygiene is important. But for them, that lack of personal hygiene could have been, right, a protective mechanism to try to keep people away. Holidays, Halloween's coming up. It's my favorite holiday. I had a kid who, something happened to this kid on Halloween, and I'm pretty sure it was a sexual abuse situation, but was not, like really hated it, didn't want to participate in it. So, you just have to keep those things in mind. It can be, it could be a lot of these things, but we don't know. We don't get the ability to get that information in advance from kids, and that's hard. So just keep those things in mind. A lot of times those kids they don't have the language, like I say, to sometimes even identify. I had a young person talk to me years later and say, when this was going on, I didn't have the language for it, but like, this is what was happening to me. And so it takes time for them and for them to feel safe to be able to disclose some of those things. I had another kiddo who's with us for quite some time. Alcohol was really triggering for her. And turns out she had a mom's boyfriend. I don't think it was a stepfather, but he drank a lot. And so I remember we took the kids to a friend's house. This was several years ago. And not only did he drink, but he would also drink and drive. And so it wasn't until some time had passed that she was able to say, I'm really uncomfortable. So she saw my husband have like a beer at like a dinner or a cookout or something. And then it was a beer, and then he drove us home a couple hours later. And that was really upsetting for her. And she was able to thankfully tell me about that. And I was like, no problem. Like, I don't really drink. So like, I will always drive. And then he just stopped drinking in front of her because it was upsetting for her in general. So we're willing to make a lot of accommodations for kids. So regulating an overactive stress response, we really encourage our kids to be physical, and sometimes you've got to get creative if you're with a kid and you're in a situation where you don't have the luxury of time or space. Bike riding is a really big thing in this house. My husband rides a lot, and that's been a really good point of connection for a lot of kids that have come into our home who maybe, they know how to ride a bike, but they maybe didn't have a bike. And so we take them out and about. We also have 3 dogs. So walking has been a really effective tool for kids. So, if you're at school, that's a great opportunity to let a kid just take a lap, right? Like wherever they need to, let them get outside, let them get some fresh air, just give them some space to kind of process and calm down. I want to jump into some important. I'm gonna throw a lot of stuff at you guys. This was really hard for me to try to figure out, like, oh gosh, what can I share with you in 20 minutes? So introductions is really important. For me as a foster parent, the first placement I ever had was a sibling group, actually the exact same ages of my kids. So the little boy was 11, the little girl was 7, and we're gonna talk about them later. Jack and Jenny is what we're calling them. And I remember Jack was changing schools, and when we were getting ready to, get him registered and do all these things, he had said something to me in our conversation about his previous foster mom had to go into the office at his old school. And when she was just talking to the person behind the desk, she referred to herself as his foster mom. And he was so horrified, you all. Now, I've had kids who were like, nope, I refer to you as my foster mom, Sarah, and that's fine. But the lesson that I learned, thankfully, really early on with my very first placement of kids is it's really important to know how you want those kids to reference you. And if you are somebody on the other side of this, if you're not a foster parent, if you're a teacher, if you're whatever your role is, however you're interacting with a kid, it's important to know, how do you want me to refer to Sarah, right? Is Sarah your foster mom? Do you want me just to call her mom? Is she aunt? Is she guardian? And I always tell my kids, I can be whoever you need me to be. You can call me Sarah here. And if you want to refer to me as mom out in public, that's fine. Like you get what you need out of the situation. Because the last thing kids need are other kids or adults, maybe giving them more focus to something that they're not super excited about as far as, their situation. They don't need all the additional questions. So I think that's super important. I also make sure I'm clear on our kids that come into our home about what their pronouns are. I share share my pronouns. And then kids might go by a different name. We've certainly had that. We had a kiddo who was transgender and it was going by another name that was not on their birth certificate. So it's just really important to respect that and honor that for those kiddos. And then I want to give you guys a couple bits of more information about why our LGBTQ population is so important. These are 2 different studies which are referenced at the end, but the one to the left there around the homelessness, that is our fastest growing population, unfortunately. of young people is our LGBTQ. So some of those folks are not even making it into the foster care system. They might be couch surfing, or, you know, they could be hanging out, you know, in a shelter or on the street. And some of those kids are in foster care, and some of those kids might be taking off. Some of those kids might be aging out. Right, there's a lot of different things that are going on, but it's really important for us to pay attention to those numbers, because nobody should be homeless, particularly our youth. And then over here, the association between kids who've been in care and suicide. And unfortunately, I've had some experience with that. I mean, you're expecting kids to also be depressed as well. So sometimes we've got kids who are really, you know, struggling. And I did have a young person, my son called me one time, and he said, and this is somebody else we'll talk about later, but he said, Stacy has herself in her room, and she said that she has cut her wrist, and she called the ambulance herself. Now, I am on the expressway driving home with my youngest in the back, who I just picked up from elementary school. So I'm hearing this message, and I'm thinking, I have no idea what I'm going to walk into. And so I called a neighbor who lives a few doors down, and I said, hey, I've got a really tough situation on my hands. I don't know what I'm walking into. Somebody is not safe. I need to drop my kid off at your house. I want to make sure you're home and you're going to be there, because I don't want to roll 5 houses down and have her with me. So yeah, it's real. So I just wanted to call out for that. Also, probably not surprising to anybody on this call, our kids of color are still disproportionately represented in the foster care system. When you look at the amount of kids in the general population, and then how that compares to our foster care. So again, we need more families. You know, we're kind of coming at this from twofold. How do we prevent kids from coming into foster care to begin with? How do we get those services put in place for families? But while we're doing that, we also need to hit, you know, things up from the other side, which is making sure that we have enough families that mirror our youth population as well. So some other best practices that I want to get into, and this is huge. So again, I just called out specifically, you know, 2 places where, you know, kids might have some sort of physical contact. It shocks me, and I live in this, and I'm deep in trauma. So I get it that like everybody else isn't thinking about this all the time like I am, but it does shock me how many times I walk into a doctor's office and there's no sort of, you know, talk or telling about what they're going to do prior to. So that's really important. You know, if you're the person there with the young person, my whole bit is just about like, hey, here's what I need, you know, here's the request. I just need you, before you start any sort of physical exam, I just need you to talk and tell them what you're going to do, so that they know what's coming at them. So for kids, I mean, it's weird anyways when you're just, right, like seeing somebody you don't know for the first time, and they're lifting up the back of your shirt and sticking something cold, you know, and they're just, you know, they're just like in their mode. And so we just need to ask our providers to slow down and to let them know, you know, what's happening, and checking in with them, you know, like if at any point we need to stop or take a break, like let me know. Same thing with our educators. I've seen kids, somebody put just their hand on their shoulder to be like, hey, it's so good to see you. And you see them just tense up. So, you know, I would say intentions are great, and they don't matter if they are making somebody feel uncomfortable. So we just have to pay attention to that, not take it personal, and make sure that we're using our words. This is a real struggle for me, isn't it? Another best practice is just around space, physical and personal. So I mentioned a kiddo that we had, Stacy. She had so much physical abuse happening in that house that she was constantly on edge. And so what we learned really quick with her was how important her physical space was. So these are just some things to say, like, hey, here's some best practices. It even got to the point with her, that she asked if we could put a lock on the door, which I was happy to comply with, because that made her feel safe. And, so we had to say, look, no one's ever going to go into your room. I said, look, if I have laundry for you, do you want me to take it in there? Or do you want me to leave it outside your door? So like whatever makes them feel, but just be really mindful that they're people too. And that is a really easy way that you can respect them. So this is really important. Importantly, the keep your face fixed is an expression that I learned from one of the trainers that I had, Kanita Dorsey, and she was phenomenal. But she was like, kids are going to lay a lot of stuff on you at some point. So be ready for that, because the last thing a kid needs is to see your face completely fall out or your jaw hit the ground when they tell you some really bad things that they've experienced. They don't need to take on your emotions or feel shamed about that or anything of that nature. So it's just really important that you hit these 5 points. I had a young girl who hit our home just on an emergency basis. I think she was here for 2 nights. And she was very open, and it actually caught me off guard how open she was. But this is a kid who had been through human, trafficking, sex trafficking, some of the things that she was experiencing and things that she felt like she could tell me. And we just sat on the floor in her room, and I was helping her go through things that she'd asked for some help with. And she was telling me about these things, and I just listen. But these are good things for kids to hear you say. This could be so many slides, you guys. This was really hard for me to keep this, but apologizing when you're wrong is really important. So a lot of times, I don't think a lot of my kiddos that have been with me are used to people apologizing to them, because I think we as adults just don't do a really good job of that. Like when we're wrong, we're just like, oh, okay, I was wrong. But then there's like no apology to follow. So I always say, and this is something I taught my kids when they were little, when you're apologizing, you be specific as to what you're sorry for. And there never should be the but, right? I always tell my kids also, a lot of times my kids will, if I apologize, I say, oh, I'm sorry. And oh, it's okay. And I'm like, it's not okay. Here's some good responses, right? You can thank somebody for your apology, accept your apology. I won't go through every single one, but these are my best practices. And these are the things that I'm recommending that would be helpful for you all to integrate to help our young folks. Meaningful questions. I really think this is one of the worst questions. The how are you doing? It's right up there with what do you do? So I always just say, like, be really specific with kids and figure out, where you fit in. Maybe all of these questions are not appropriate for you to ask, depending on what your relationship is with this young person, how long you've known them, etc. But something that I personally do is I like to ask kids, when they first come to stay with us, is tell me what makes you feel safe. Because I want to put anything in place that makes them feel safe. So a locked doorknob made somebody feel safe. Great. Night lights might make somebody else feel safe. Whatever it is, I can put those very tangible things in place. And then if I can get to that point in the conversation with a kid about what makes them feel unsafe, they may not tell me like all of the things, but they might give me some good clues that could help me as well. So this is such a big thing, and this is a whole segment within itself, but we have a serious issue with medication with our kids that are in care. The numbers for kids in Kentucky are higher. I'm sure a lot of people on this call already know that, but it is shocking to me how many times kids will come to my home, or how many times I have gotten calls where, kids, I get so much information sometimes about, here are some diagnoses that they might have on this child and medications that they are taking, but we have our kids on too many medications, period. And we have got to start the practice of deprescribing medications. And something that I'm also not seeing happening a lot with our kids are having these neuropsychological evaluations. So I have had kids come to me on medication. Again, one of my first placements, and I walked into, it was being managed at 7 counties / Centerstone. And I just said, hey, I'm just curious. I'm looking for some back information on, why is she on this medication? It was for ADHD. How long has she been on it? And there was no evaluation. There's no nothing. And I don't say this to call out any particular organization. I'm just like, this is the experience, right? So we might feel a little uncomfortable sometimes as we have these conversations, but I always say, if you're not uncomfortable, we're probably not talking about the right thing. So, right. So we also need these training on ACEs, and we need to be able to reduce the dose of adversity for stress for kids, and the training in the education as well for dysregulating, helping them to dysregulate their system. So we just, as an industry for healthcare, whether that's mental or physical, there's a lot of work that needs to be done around this area. I've had kids show up with bags of medicine. That could be a whole section, like I said. So it's scary. Also, diagnosis is sometimes can help us. I'm not saying that if you have an evaluation that you're always going to hit the right diagnosis, but this is what happens a lot. A lot of our kids, and again, the calls that I get, they're on some sort of ADHD medication. Now, I'm somebody who has a lot of experience with that because I have a spouse and 2 biological children, and a family history on my husband's side of that. So we're very close friends with ADHD. But a lot of times, people are getting confused about the trauma that kids have experienced because there is some overlap. But we don't need to be so quick to put kids on medication. And a lot of times what else will happen is if the medication for ADHD isn't working, then I'm seeing kids, right, get prescribed some antipsychotics. And again, we just have our numbers are just too high across the board. And I'll have some things that we can reference here at the end of this. So I'm going to give you guys just a couple of short little, we'll call them case studies, but these are really just kids that, that were with me so I can give you some information. So this was Michael. He had been in foster care for 3 years, strictly residential and hospital. And, called me at 5:30 in the morning. This kid was leaving a hospital setting. So it was an emergency situation. This young man has so much potential and had a lot of things because of his movement around that just weren't being caught. And so these are just a couple of things I wanted to highlight about, what was important to him. He really had so much motivation to work. He'd already secured a job before he'd even come to be in care with me. But he had a real hard time transferring that work ethic and that discipline about that to all these other areas of his life. And he was with me for about a month and a half. And thankfully is home now, but there was a lot of things going on there and a lot of things to say. I'm not sure that this kid should have ever been in care to begin with. So again, that's a whole nother conversation. Our little friends, Jack and Jenny, who I told you were my first placement. So I cannot remember if their mom was in prison or if they were removed because of drugs and then she went to prison. But again, this was a complicated case. These kids had been in care for a while and there was actually a third sibling. So, these kiddos were actually reunited, the 3 of them, and were actually adopted out, which is good if we can't do a reunification. But I just wanted to touch base on some of these kids so you can see who has been in my home. Here's my friend Stacy. So she was with us for the longest. An incredible kid. A lot of times our kids are also getting pulled for truancy, and we need to figure that out. I've had several kids get removed for that. So it's like, what are we not getting at from the educational standpoint? How are we not intervening from there before it gets out of hand? But there was also some very, very unhygienic living conditions that involved animals and feces and things of that nature. But she had been through a lot. And if you see up there at the top, the ACE score, this is me just getting an idea of knowing what kids have disclosed to me over the years and knowing what maybe a little bit of information was shared with me from a social worker. But the reality is we don't know. We don't know what numbers kids have. You know, sometimes I've learned that and built those numbers over time that kids have been with me, they've shared information with me. So we just really need to assume that every child has a number so that we can change kind of where we're functioning from and how we're supporting those kids, because they need it. They need a lot from us. So that's going to be where I stop. I hope it hasn't been too overwhelming, but hopefully you guys have heard some things that have been helpful. And I know there's a lot of expertise in this room as well. So I look forward to hearing any sort of feedback. And again, these are my personal experiences that I've had with kiddos. And it's so much more broad and deep than this, but this was the best I could do. You asked the balance team, it was real hard for me. But I'll turn it back over to whoever would like to jump in and take us to the next part of the program.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. We really appreciate the insight. And I know that there are a lot of folks who have experience with foster care or experienced foster parenting or providing kinship care as well on this call. So I think when we get into the breakout rooms, we're going to have a lot of robust conversation with a lot of folks who have good personal experience who can really speak to it. So what we're hoping to do within the breakout rooms is we're going to take about 15 minutes to get together and really talk about how we interact with young people who are in foster care or kinship care, who we interact with, you know, within our profession or within our personal lives, and really kind of reflect on how we support foster youth and families and avoid re-traumatization. So we're going to be just having you all reflect on questions related to what should I stop doing on a personal, professional, or community level? What should I start doing based on, you know, what we heard from Sarah, some recommendations and tips, or what we're hearing within those breakout groups based on folks who have personal lived experience, or what should I continue doing? So we're going to break out into those small groups for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll report out 1 to 2 key takeaways. So I think Carly's going to stick us into groups shortly here. As folks are joining, just a reminder to our facilitators that we are going to share 1 to 2 takeaways from what we heard within the robust conversation. I know our group could have went for like 45 more minutes probably talking about, and I would really like to actually if we go back in, but I know folks have other things to do. But we'll be sharing 1 to 2 takeaways, and if there are other things that like you heard in your group that our facilitators are not sharing, feel free to drop those back in the chat, and make sure that other folks are hearing that as well. I know that one of the benefits of those breakout groups is we kind of get to know each other a little bit too. We meet people we haven't met before. We've got people from Paducah, Woodford, Eastern Kentucky, so there's some good opportunity there. So what I'm going to do is kind of kick it to our facilitators to share those 1 to 2 takeaways. And I'll just go first really quickly and then pitch it to the next facilitator who wants to just jump right in after I'm done. So if you're ready to jump in and share those, please do. What I think I heard from our participants, there was a lot of really great experience in around the virtual table with being foster parents or having experience in the system. One of the things that really stood out to them was that need to slow down and just be intentional. When Sarah was talking about talking and telling, or talking through the process if you're at the doctor's office, or really slowing down and engaging in questions that are more meaningful or personal. And then one of the other things that I heard from our group member was that we have a lot of learning and education in this space around adverse childhood experiences, but sometimes actually putting those strategies into practice can be difficult, or sometimes you're not really sure how to apply them. So more conversation about what that looks like and how we do that in practice, in our own personal practice in our community, is really key. So I'm going to kick it over to the next facilitator who wants to go ahead and jump in and share their takeaways, and then we'll just kind of round robin.
This is Joe Barjone. I'll go next. And so 2 takeaways for our group. 1 is using more strengths-based language with children and the behaviors. So instead of saying they're being manipulative, they're getting their needs met, right? And they're adapting to their situation. Then the second thing we talked about is stop excluding the kids from decision-making. That impacts their lives. Giving them voice and choice is really important as much as possible. It empowers the young people.
Well, this is Tony. Our group had a really interesting discussion, and it was a little different than I expected in some ways. We had a lot of conversation initially about the importance of family preservation and family reunification as a way of reducing demand on the foster system. Foster parents working with kids have lots of needs and things we can support. Families of origin face some of those same stresses, and that if we can offer and do the same kinds of things with families of origin, we can maybe keep families together a little bit longer, or we can get them back together faster and less stress and demand to come up with great foster families. And then the second thing was, we had a lot of conversation about the importance of understanding families and kids on a very individualized basis. It takes a high level of trust to understand what's really going on underneath and build out the supports and interventions and services and relationships that you need on an individual basis to really help repair some of the damage that trauma creates.
This is Barbara Bailey. Reports. Can y'all hear me?
Yes. Barbara, unmute yourself, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We had a couple of things that haven't been spoken about so far. One being, one of our members has noticed that there are so many little paper signs along the road advertising for foster parents, and that is a real that just makes foster children and the whole foster system seem unimportant when you're advertising for it, like getting your house painted. So she feels like that's just belittling to foster kids and foster families. She'd like to see that stopped. The other thing is, one of our participants was a foster child, or she was a foster child. Now she's an adult. And she just really appreciated the LGBTQ community now being included, and she thinks it's really important that we continue in the training and as part of the foster care system to really acknowledge and understand what these kids are going through and make sure we do a better job with that.
I'll go next. This is BJ Atkins. And I'm just we had such a robust discussion. I'm gonna focus on the things that were good thoughts that, secondary trauma. What are we doing to help the foster parent? What are we doing to help the worker? How can we be more supportive in that way, knowing that there is secondary trauma and helping people care for themselves? The other thing I thought was very good is ACEs and screening and knowledge around ACEs for pregnant women. These could be women who had never had the opportunity to think about it. We know that how we behave as parents, as a parent of 2 kids, it impacts my children's behavior. I always knew when I came home from work with a lot of stress, my kids picked up on that stress immediately. So I had to figure out how to de-stress myself and work with them as we move forward with our evening, helping parents rather than removing. And I think that's something that was said early on, the cost effectiveness of helping parents rather than opening a case and it going through a system. But some of the positive things that we thought is, we attract great parents, and Sarah's an example of that. Let's celebrate those parents. And keep on educating people about adverse childhood experiences, which we are doing as part of Bounce, and normalizing adverse childhood experiences so that people know this happens. This happens to all of us. It is not something you have to live the rest of your life, but it's something you can become aware of and make changes accordingly. So we had a great group, a great discussion, and I welcome anyone in the group to further my comments.
This is Patricia, and I was not part of BJ's group, but I will report out for my group. We had a really great discussion and kind of building off the theme. I think there was some clear kind of takeaways personally about, how could I change my language? My personal response to, when somebody has an attitude, that was a real aha for some members in the group about thinking that through. But we also had a really good then conversation about, I guess, what should I start doing, and some ideas around. The group thought it was important to have continuous learning on what works for kids and building our competency skills. I think there's so much research in this area, and one in particular that Keith shared with me that I was really fascinated was about dialectical based training and using that as a tool. And what I learned was that's the concept that two opposite ideas can be true at the same time. So rather than giving kids the identity, making their trauma experience their main identity, it's like, yes, being able to accept it and to change at the same time, which I thought was really interesting. But the overall focus was that it's on all of us to continue learning and figuring out how we can align with one another as professionals and individuals.
Nikki or Courtney, would you all like to share?
Yeah, I can jump in. Sorry, Nikki. Just good job. So one of the big takeaways for us, I think, was fostering community and lifelong involvement with foster parents. So, just understanding that you can make an impact regardless of how long a foster youth stays with you. Whether it's a week or a year, you really want to develop that type of a relationship where they feel comfortable coming back to you when they need that support. And we had a couple of people who shared some stories about young people, just calling to say that they needed somewhere to go for Thanksgiving. So just, opening yourself up that way. And also just trying to get away from this notion or this practice of cutting ties with young people when they reach a certain age. How we say they age out of care, as if once they age out, you just don't even have to care about them or think about them or be connected to them at all. So that was probably the biggest takeaway from our group.
And hi, everyone. I'll share. We had just a great discussion. I'm happy that these notes are going to go out to the whole group since we're covering two pieces of it today. But I think, too, that I want to lift up, and anyone that was in the breakout group, please put something in the chat to make sure I get this right. But the two I want to lift up is really a theme around training. And so there was this, things that we want to continue are the training in youth mental health first aid. We want teachers to be trained if they haven't been in trauma-informed care. And then I'm going to add in training for race-based trauma as well as being important, and then educating, training our foster parents and others on different types of genders and just understanding. And Sarah touched on that. So that was one big one, was training. The other one I'm going to lift up from the Voices of the Commonwealth. And I think some information is going to be in the chat about the Voices of the Commonwealth in case anyone is not familiar with that foster alumni group. But this is coming directly from one of their staff, and that is, and another person in our group mentioned this too, but we really want to see sibling separation stopped and ended. We really want siblings to stay together. What I heard in the breakout room is that this is a gigantic problem. It sounds like it has been for many years. And actually the Voices of the Commonwealth, these young adults are actually doing advocacy around this right now. They're really digging into this. The other thing that the Voice of the Commonwealth are doing coupled with this is we want to see adoption disruption stopped. Once young people are adopted, we want to put supports around that family like we would any family, bio family or such, foster family. But we want to stop these adoption disruptions. And those were two of the things that we spent time on, but so many other good notes that I'm going to get out to Carly.
I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in every single group, because it sounds like each group had different takeaways, some like obvious similarities, but some really strong ideas around what we can do as community members or professionals. It sounds like especially Nikki's group has like a real bias for action, which is a great segue into the conversation that we're having next, where Sarah's going to talk a bit about continuing this conversation and what we can do. So Sarah, I'll kick it to you.
Thank you, Shannon. I just want to say thank you guys so much. I was telling Carly when you all were all in your breakouts that I feel like every slide I could have talked 20 minutes easy about every slide. So there's a lot of information that that I had to kind of go through at a high level. But for this part, I really just want to continue the conversation with you all. I want to know if there's particular questions that you have. I really try to, keep myself as an open book. If there's something that you heard that you want more information on, or if you have an expertise in some of places where some of this information might have showed up, and you can share that stuff. I know there's some stuff being put in the chat, and I think that's great. And I'm also happy to screen share again and just let you guys know. I mean, the big takeaway is I want you all to leave here feeling more informed. I want you to figure out what are the small things that you can do like right away, right? Because we all need those easy wins, like, oh, I can do these things. But then I'm going to ask you to go after something bigger and harder because it's important and because it matters. And so whatever that is, if you want to do that individually on behalf of your organizations, collaborating with some of these organizations that are in the room and saying, okay, we're going to make this a priority. And I really just want people to go after this with a lot of energy. And I'm going to screen share just really quick, and then I want people just unmute. And if you just have a comment, or if, it doesn't have to be a question. I'd really love to just hear feedback that you all have. I did just stop, and I apologize because I meant to share with you all. I'm assuming you can see the proper right slide. So I mentioned some of these resources, and we'll share this presentation afterwards. Some of the things that were hit on here, but also just the follow-up as far as please reach out to me if you have additional questions or you want additional information. But I'm really asking folks to reach out to the people who can help put some policies in place that will benefit our kids. There's a lot of conversation that we haven't even talked about, things that were briefly touched on. I know we're coming into a new budget year. Listen, you all, we need our social workers to be compensated. We are losing them, and the commissioner speaks very open and candidly about this, which I appreciate that they're hemorrhaging, right? So I don't know how we can help kids if we don't have the social workers in place to help kids. We're working at this deficit, right? We don't have enough social workers, we don't have enough foster parents. So we've got to move really swiftly and quickly. And while people love to say money can't fix everything, this is going to be a great place to start. We need funding in order to keep our social workers who are doing the most important work on behalf of these kiddos and families. And we need to make sure we can get funding put in front of this for those preventative services. So if I'm remembering correctly, when we were doing that initiative, what was that, October, a couple of years ago, Family First, I don't believe, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, we weren't creating a new pot of money. We were just saying, here's this pot of money we have, and now we're going to allow certain funds to be used in a way that we hadn't used them before. And unfortunately, while that seems helpful, we don't have enough money as it is to help with the situation of just with kids once they're coming into care. So there's so many things we could talk about, but I want to pause and zip and turn it over to you all, because you're why I'm here. and I want to hear what you all have to say.
Sarah, I'll jump in here because you and I have talked about this, but because the work is large, because we have such support even on this call and beyond, I know the thought of a foster parent, pick of kin, kinship, I guess, type of coalition has been discussed. I think I know that we have a kinship, right? We have a kinship coalition already. I think I understand that correctly. So we're looking now, can we also have a foster parent, pick of kin type of coalition? And bring in the numbers and the support into a space where we can continue this dialogue and actions and advocacy. So that's something that I know has been discussed. I know we discussed it, and maybe that's a possibility.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki, for bringing that up. So while I do think that there is maybe like a Facebook group of folks who have formed, something just online in a space there, I don't know that there is any sort of official coalition for foster parents who are advocating for kids. And I just want to say how important it is that we keep our kids with their families. So we need to get our act together around our kinship care and helping those families. On one of the slides, I didn't mention this, but you might have read it. So for our friends, Jack and Jenny, my first placements that came to me, I remember him saying to me one day, he said, when we first had to leave our home, he said, we all three went with an aunt, and it was the aunt who had the least. And he said, and she's the only one that stepped up to take us. And she could, and the reality of that situation is that she couldn't financially afford, because I believe she had some children of her own, she could not financially afford taking on 3 additional children. So what happened, and this is going to be a callback to keeping our siblings together, is they had a sister who was 3 at the time, so 7, 11, and 3. And so the youngest one went into foster care. And then a little bit more time passed and she realized, I can't do this. Then the next youngest one went into foster care, and she thought she could hang on to him. So then the 2 girls were put together and he was there. And then it just inevitably got to the point where she couldn't even keep him. So then you've got kids, right? So now he's separated from his sisters, and it's complicated for a lot of reasons, but it is so important for our kids to be able to stay with relatives and for them to get the training and the support and the financial assistance that they need for these kids, just like foster parents do.
Sarah, it's Mark. I'm piggybacking on a comment of Annie Connors in the chat, but could you speak a little bit your experience working with the bio parents of some of your foster kids?
Sure. So it varies, just because sometimes kids have access to parents and sometimes they don't. So like our first placement, Jack and Jenny, there was no contact, right? And these were kiddos who were already in foster care. So sometimes I'm getting kids who are coming in from another home, and sometimes they're coming straight from their home. So sometimes I have the ability to connect with the parents, sometimes I don't. It also just depends on what the rules are which I always try to be really clear about getting that information from a social workers, is to say, so tell me what communications with, the family look like. Are they being allowed, and are we doing physical visits, or obviously now we're, potentially virtual visits? Are we doing just phone calls? So I'm always really clear with parents when a kiddo's with me, like, I'm not trying to keep your kid from you. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so I'm just really clear that I am here to take, my goals are to take care of your kid to the best of my ability while they're here, get them everything they need until you can get into a position where they can go back. So I always really emphasize that reunification. And for the most part, for the few families that I have had the ability to talk with, they've been pretty positive, relationships. Nobody's like calling me now just to like catch up. And that's okay. I understand that I played the role, and when your kiddo's back to you, like, I'm sure it's like they appreciate it, I'm sure, but it's like, okay, we're done, right? But some of the kids, I have the ability to, we'll reach out. But, there was only one time that I had a really tricky situation with a parent. He just wasn't following a lot of rules and wasn't being super helpful about being honest with the kids about why the kids were there, and was just saying some things that made my job really hard. Like, they just want to keep you in care because they're making money off of you, things like that. So then you're trying to have a conversation with that kid. She was 11, right? So it's like, well, how do you right? Like, how do you respond to that, right? So, and I always make sure that that I try to give those biological families the utmost respect. And I'm going to be real honest. So we had to have some pretty tough conversations, me and her, about, here's what I'm hearing you say, and this unfortunately is not the situation, and I just need you to know that I'm going to be real honest with her about what the situation is. And that one was just a little challenging. There wasn't a whole lot of other emotions around it. It just this person just wasn't super helpful. They were pretty manipulative. This is also a kid who was one of 5, and all kids were spread out, and they'd been in care for 4 years. So I can't imagine what it's like to be in that situation, but I really just try to partner to the best of my ability and give those families the support and let them know that when the kid goes back, I'm happy to still be a resource for them and for that child. This was mentioned in some of the call outs. The report outs is just about, continuing those relationships with kids. I always tell kids, look, there's people you're born related to, and then there's the people that you just make your family. And this house will always be open to you if you need to come back for any reason, or you need to contact me or call me. I always make sure to leave my information like in either a notebook or a book I give them, because they may lose their cell phone or it may get cut off or what have you. And I don't know how many people in this call, I'm sure people on this call still have like at least 5 phone numbers that right off the top of your head, right? But our young people don't, because they don't know what it's like to memorize phone numbers. So I always make sure I physically write it down and say, you reach out to me. I don't care if it's 2 years from now and you haven't talked to me. Don't be weird about it. It's not weird for me. You call me if you need something. So I don't know if that answered your question, Mark, but great.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, I hate to cut this off because the discussion is so great, but our time is up for today. And I wanted to thank you first all for taking part in this. And there's a couple of things I just want to follow up with right now. Carly is dropping in the chat a link that you can contact your legislature. And if you feel compelled at all to do that, as we've talked about, we need help. We need help getting the system fixed. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and it needs to be called to the attention of our representatives. So please contact your legislator, and that is dropped in the chat now. Also, there's a survey. We want to continue to make this Grand Rounds event be something that is very helpful to you. So please take the survey. We look at it very carefully. Your comments are very important to us to help make future Grand Rounds very as helpful as they can be. Also in the link is a resources page of things that you can do to different resources to make a difference in the foster care program. So please look at that, and that's there for you so that you can take some action if you would like to make a difference in the lives of many children. And stay tuned. We'll be having another Bounce Grand Rounds in the spring. We'll be letting you know about that soon. And again, thank you, Sarah, and everyone that plans this. I think we had a great program. All you participants added so much. Thank you so much. And let's go out and help these children and all children in our state and our community. Thank you.